continuing series of speakers. Dr. David Robarge was the CIA's chief historian. So tonight he is here to speak to the Spies next door, about spies in Arlington and the surrounding area. So thank you all again for coming, and please give our guest speaker a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation from Annette and John to speak to you. We're going to have three stories tonight that are interrelated, not just in part because they all occurred in whole or in part in Arlington, but rather there's a common theme running through them all, which is counterintelligence. We're going to first hear about one of the great counterintelligence successes in United States history, one that opened a lot of people's eyes to the Soviet intelligence threat immediately after World War II, but which regrettably ended with a counterintelligence disaster when the activity was betrayed to the enemy, the Soviet Union. In part because of the enormous amount of information gained through that program, a particular individual and longtime Arlington resident became, some would say, obsessed with the idea of Soviet penetration of the intelligence services and went off on a lengthy mole hunt seeking the insidious force within that was betraying huge amounts of U.S. intelligence secrets to the enemy. Because his career went down in flames abruptly, much of what he had done for good was forgotten, and what he had done not for good was remembered. And for a while, the counterintelligence discipline inside the U.S. intelligence community was largely forgotten. And it was because of that that the third person we'll talk about tonight emerged as the most destructive spy in CIA's history. Thankfully, after a while caught, there was some dogged counterintelligence work, and we're still, in a sense, trying to overcome the challenges that resulted from the loss of counterintelligence capability back in the 1980s. And that's kind of where we'll end with the discussion. Let's begin with the first story, which takes place right here at Arlington Hall, located off of Route 50 between South Glebe and South George Mason. Well, what was going on at Arlington Hall? We'll get to that in a minute, but let me show you what Arlington Hall used to look like. Right now, it is the George Shultz Center for Foreign Service Education. I think that's the formal name of it, or some variant thereof. Located still on the grounds, though, as you can see there from the C marking, is a beautiful facility called Arlington Hall, which was originally a women's junior college founded in 1927 and described in a contemporary recruitment brochure as a lovely 100-acre campus offering interesting variety with its open lawns, landscaped gardens, and wooded sections. Well, this is too tempting a location for the Army to pass up. And when it was passing by, after doing reconnaissance in the Washington metro area, looking for a location where it could put its Signals Intelligence Service, that is the organization that intercepted communications from enemy military forces and then deciphered or decrypted those messages to make sense of them, it needed a secure location. Arlington Hall was both close enough to the Washington area, but believe it or not, back at that time, that location was relatively isolated and could be rendered fairly secure. It is a beautiful location, and thankfully, the main part of Arlington Hall, the original classroom and dormitory buildings and an annex building still remain, along with the George Shultz compound. We'll page through some of the very nice views of the location as it was shown during the time. And then after a while, we'll get a little bit of a peek inside. This was a postcard that was used as a recruiting device to get Army people to want to work at Arlington Hall. It looks like a pretty bucolic setting when you think of what most Army facilities are like. Not bad work if you could get it. And it eventually grew because the Arlington Hall facility itself, which was the only structure on that location, was very quickly overcome. It was too small. You simply couldn't house enough people there. Eventually, about 3,800 individuals worked at Arlington Hall for the Army Signals Intelligence Service. So those atrocious temporary buildings, kind of like what cropped up all over Washington, down on the Mall and along the Tidal Basin and such back during World War I, and then remained there during World War II, some rebuilt, some destroyed, those cropped up. So Building A and Building B were attached to the very nice architecture there of the main hall. There it is, a real eyesore that thankfully with it and its equally ugly partner Building B no longer exist. Thankfully though, the other two structures are on the National Registry of Historic Places and presumably inviolate for all time, practically. Now, what went on inside Arlington Hall if you were working for the Army Signals Intelligence Service and later the Army Security Agency, as it came to be renamed after World War II? Well, if you worked inside Arlington Hall, you first parked your vehicle or got off the bus, and you walked through a security gate to make sure you were supposed to be there. And then you wandered into a number of very nice office settings that make Dilbert Land look like an executive suite. This is unair conditioned. You're just dealing with fans and open windows and radiators and such. It was a pretty bleak place to work, packed with people who are busily trying to work on two extremely important projects. A couple more shots of the interior. Eventually, Arlington Hall is turned over to the Defense Intelligence Agency, which was created in 1961, and its initial location was there at Arlington Hall. It later moved out to Bolling Air Force Base to the DIAC, as it's called, the Defense Intelligence Analysis Center. Well, what's going on inside the building here? One thing that they were doing, which I'm not talking about because it doesn't have a connection with Arlington, was breaking Japanese military codes. It was very important work at Arlington Hall that helped achieve military victory in World War II. But what I want to talk about tonight in particular is one of the most important counterintelligence accomplishments in U.S. history, which is breaking a seemingly unbreakable Soviet secret messaging system used by its intelligence services and by various front organizations like trade missions and diplomatic establishments, all intended to communicate between Moscow Center and the spy networks that they had established inside the United States almost immediately upon diplomatic recognition being granted in 1933. This program begins in 1943 because the head of the Army Signals Intelligence Service, a man named General George Clark, was very suspicious of long-term Soviet motives. And he told the people at the SIS, Signals Intelligence Service, we know we're going to be fighting these people later on after the war is over. They're our allies now, but it isn't over yet. Let's start figuring out what they're doing here. And so he launches this program involving the interception of diplomatic and intelligence and trade communications that is carried over commercial lines. And under the war powers granted the United States, this can all be intercepted. Well, that's okay, except you can't read it because it seems to be in an undecipherable secret writing system, an unbreakable code. So here you have at Arlington Hall an analog to what was going on out at Bletchley Park, the kind of things you've been seeing perhaps on the TV if you're watching the Bletchley Girls or whatever the program is called. It's an analog to that. And indeed, many of the code breakers working at Arlington Hall were female. It was heavily staffed by women, but it also had a heavy influx of mathematicians and other experts on language, because one of the things you need to do if you're going to break somebody's secret writing system is understand how the language works. And those are the kind of people who were imported in. Now what they started to find out as they looked at all of these thousands and thousands of intercepted communications is that there were 5 different code systems going on. The trade missions were using one, diplomats another, the KGB, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and then the Military Intelligence Service, both the Army and the Navy sides. They're all communicating, apparently, it seemed, with different communications systems. And to make it even more complicated, the whole project language is what we call double encrypted. It's kind of 2 layers of secrecy that make it all the harder to break. You're working from a code book, and then once you use those fake terms, you then encrypt those with a special cipher system that I'll show you in a minute. That's the one-time pad that's shown in the photograph. A one-time pad is theoretically unbreakable because it is a set of random numbers that are only used once. And if used properly, you never can break into it, because the only people who know what you're using to write and decipher the system are the sender and the recipient. And once you throw away the information used to make the writing unreadable, nobody else can read it. So what is the challenge that's faced here? Not just the huge amount of traffic to read, but also this incredibly difficult system. Well, what they found out was this. And this is really dogged pen and pencil to paper work. We're not talking here about fancy Cray computers that can run huge amounts of code-breaking programs and all this. We're talking about incredibly complicated crossword puzzles. And all you can do is examine message after message after message, looking for some kind of pattern that shouldn't be there. And this is what the code breakers at Arlington Hall were able to discover. They used these old-fashioned IBM punch card readers. This was as fancy as it got at the time. But just by pure repetition of looking at the messages over and over and over again, suddenly little patterns emerged. And this is a cryptanalyst's dream. Finding those repetitions which indicate that somebody isn't using the one-time pad right, because there shouldn't be any repetitions. And they also found that the messages contained distinctive patterns. They always seemed to be written in the same format. Words or phrases seemed to be used at different places at different times in the same way. So suddenly there you have another pattern. And pretty soon you have 3 or 4 little breaks into the messages. Now this is real tough, dogged work. And it took quite a while for the cryptanalysts to figure it out. There were some very important leading lights in the project, all of them working out at Arlington Hall. The woman, Jean Graybeal, who came up with the whole idea after General Clark said, go start finding out what the real enemy is about. And then you had a couple of important individuals, Halleck and Phillips, who made the first breaks into 2 different systems and then noticed comparability between them, so suddenly you have more knowledge. And then the key person in the whole project, Meredith Gardner, portrayed there, he not only made other breaks, particularly uncovering some of the atomic spies, but he also worked very carefully with the FBI. And once you put together the FBI's investigations, which were based principally on defector information and surveillance of known or suspected intelligence operatives, you combine that with the increasingly useful information coming out of the Nona, suddenly you have something that you can work with in counterintelligence terms. And Gardner, an incredibly gifted linguist, he knew 12 languages. And this is the key to cryptanalysis. It's not just the mathematical ability to figure out the puzzle, but it's understanding language structure. And he put his mind to this task and came up with some very significant breaks in the system. I'll show you here 2 documents that were decrypted. About 2,200 messages were finally decrypted in whole or in part out of the thousands that were available. This is kind of like dipping a glass in a lake and trying to do an ecological study out of that. It's just a tiny fraction of all of the information available. But what information was there was really rich. One of the more intriguing ones is here, the KGB communicating back and forth with its agents in the field about what's the president's health like. I mean, you're over there, we get these news reports. Is he really as sick as he seems? And that's the report. They are afraid for Capitan's health. That was the code word used for Franklin Roosevelt. But more interestingly is this next type of message, which is a break into the Rosenberg atom spy ring. You have here a decryption of a message which very clearly identifies the key members of the Rosenberg ring. Because Ruth Greenglass, the sister-in-law, is mentioned, it doesn't take a genealogical genius to figure out who Liberal is. That's Julius Rosenberg. And the other phrases there that were code words, references to being a U.S. citizen, a member of a communist organization, and then very importantly, the Russian code word for the Manhattan Project, where the A-bomb was being developed, is referred to as enormous, kind of a interesting metaphor. Well, what do you do when you put this all together? You find out that the Soviets had placed, and this is all we know from just 2,200 communications. If we had been able to decrypt all the thousands in the Signals Intelligence Service's possession, we probably would have found hundreds and hundreds more. But these are the ones that we've identified. There are over 300 Soviet intelligence assets in the United States government. They were in the White House, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the War Production Board, the War Department, the Office of Strategic Services. If it had a national security military function during World War II, the Soviets had a penetration in it. I'll give you a quick sort of runaround here about the principal ones. Judith Copeland, shown there in the upper left, was an important figure of the Justice Department because she was involved in the Foreign Aliens Registration Branch. In other words, she knew all about all the foreigners coming in and was aware of the Soviet assets there. And she is working for the Soviets the whole time. Klaus Fuchs was probably one of the two most important figures in the development of the atom bomb. He was a Soviet agent. Ted Hall was the other one. Fuchs was caught. Hall never was. The man in the upper right is Harry Dexter White, the second highest ranking person in the Treasury Department. Lawrence Duggan, shown on the lower right with Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, the guy with the white hair. Duggan is on the right. He was a high-ranking State Department officer who, if Franklin Roosevelt had died earlier, was probably going to be the running mate of the then Vice President Henry Wallace in the next election. Imagine that, a Soviet spy, the Vice President of the United States, because Wallace probably would have won. Alger Hiss, guilty as charged. We can put this to rest forever. Just like the Rosenbergs, guilty as charged. There's no intelligent person, as far as I'm concerned, who can look at Venona and all of the other information and still argue that Hiss was innocent and was railroaded, any more than the Rosenbergs were. Now, we do know from Venona that Ethel Rosenberg, shown on the lower right of that foursome there, was a very minor player. She was not really an enabler. She just kind of washed the pots and pans, so to speak, and answered the mail and such. She was not a big player. She probably shouldn't have been executed, but her husband certainly deserved it. And you may recall the scandal of the trial there. What made all of this difficult to work with for tracking down these spies is that the Venona secret is so sensitive you can't take it to court, because doing so would compromise it. So you have to use Venona as a way of tipping you off to watch the Soviet agents do something operational. The problem was, most of the Soviet operators went to ground soon after World War II because some of the defectors from the Communist Party, like Elizabeth Bentley, some defectors from the Soviet services like Igor Gouzenko, Whittaker Chambers also, the guy who outed Hiss initially, these people scared the Soviets so much that they just closed down operational activity, which meant that you either had to have a confession or you had to trick somebody. And that's how they got Judith Copeland there in the upper left. She's guilty of 2 counts of espionage because the FBI worked up a sting operation in which they fed her interesting information that she just had to give to her Soviet handler. It was too hot to just leave on the desk. And they tried to contrive this exchange in which she would go out and meet him, but she never took the stuff out of her purse. And maybe she just got cold feet or suspected something. But the FBI just moved in anyway and grabbed them both. They tossed the Russian because he had diplomatic cover. She's thrown into jail and tried. All of the counts are thrown out on appeal because of mishandling of the case. This made it very, very difficult to use Venona unless you caught somebody in the act of espionage, which is why you had to get a collateral information for the Rosenbergs, for example, David Greenglass, the brother-in-law, finally confessing that he was part of the ring and pointing the finger at Julius and Ethel. That's the only reason why they were convicted. There was no proof positive other than Venona, and that's not going to go to court. So, an astounding amount of Soviet intelligence penetration throughout the highest levels of the government. And it's really amazing that more damage wasn't done. We do know for certain that because of the Rosenberg ring, Ted Hall, Klaus Fuchs, and others, that the Soviets got the atom bomb at least 2 to 3 years earlier than they would have. They saved a huge amount of money. But they were engaged in huge amounts of technology theft all throughout the early Cold War period. And there were a lot of other spies indicated both through Venona and now we know from Soviet archives and other information that may have done even more damage to U.S. national security. But as good as Venona was, it all ended in 1949 because of 2 traitors. One working in the Venona program and one getting the Venona information. William Weisband was a Russian linguistic expert. He was not a code breaker, but he was brought to the Army Signals Intelligence Service and then kept on with the ASA, Army Security Agency, after the war because of his Russian language skills, which, as I say, was essential to breaking these complicated codes. But he's working for the other side. And Meredith Gardner distinctly recalls Weisband hanging over his shoulder at the very time that Gardner is finding names of Soviet agents in Manhattan Project-related traffic. The secret doesn't stay very long inside Arlington Hall. The other traitor was a Brit named Kim Philby. I'm sure you've heard of him. He was the British liaison officer to U.S. intelligence services in Washington late in the 1940s. He is privy to Venona information, and you know exactly where it went as soon as he heard about it. So between these 2 individuals, the whole Venona program as a counterintelligence asset to the U.S. government ends in 1949. And in effect, we go deaf when it comes to Soviet intelligence activity. And we really don't ever get that back. Occasional breaks into Soviet intelligence communications in later years, but that ends. Because of this compromise, the Soviets completely changed their way of communicating with their agents. They went to couriers, they went to landlines, face-to-face meetings when they could do it. It's kind of the same thing that happened when bin Laden was tipped off that we were picking up his cell phone calls back in 1998. No more cell phone calls by bin Laden at that point. He goes to couriers and other types of communication. Very, very serious damage done as a result of this. Story number 2. The most famous counterintelligence officer, I think, in the Western world in the 20th century, James Angleton. Notable because he worked as the CI chief, counterintelligence chief of the agency for 20 years, and for better or for worse, shaped the way counterintelligence was conducted by the U.S. government during that period of time. And the moral of the story here is learn the right lessons from controversies and problems. And that's not what we did with Angleton, and we'll make that point a little bit later. Angleton started with the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, in 1943 as a counterintelligence officer, and he really never left the business for the rest of his career. He was shaped by and shaped in turn the counterintelligence enterprise in the U.S. government. By the end of his career, 20 years later, which went down in flames, he had become one of the most polarizing and controversial individuals in intelligence history. And we have to explain how that happened to get to the third part of our stories tonight. Angleton lived here at 4814 North 33rd Road in a rather nice looking house. Next slide. I don't know who lives there now, but I remember Angleton walking out of his front door the morning after he was fired by director William Colby because of some controversies we'll talk about in a few minutes. He had been drinking heavily and probably hadn't slept for 2 weeks because of all the surrounding difficulties and controversies. He looked terrible, made a very bad impression on film. This is probably the only thing people remember him for. or they think back also to his testimony before the Church Committee, which was investigating CIA improprieties, and see his very elusive and nebulous and guarded kind of testimony, like he's engaged in some sort of big cover-up and refusing to admit. So he's either a drunk or a liar. That's kind of what people take away from James Angleton. But there's so much more to the story, which is why I've kind of made him a special study of mine at the CIA history staff. Angleton was a brilliant practitioner of counterintelligence, not only as a discipline in the intelligence business, but also very, very adept at turning counterintelligence into kind of a bit of bureaucratic power, sort of that I know something you don't know and I'm not going to tell you. He insisted on having a lot of control over operations. He developed his own little vest pocket programs. He was given total authority over the Israeli intelligence account, not the Near East division, but the counterintelligence staff. There's a story behind that. And it's all kind of summed up in this picture here. If you control counterintelligence, you control the counterintelligence service. In addition, Angleton was a really kind of quirky guy. And he's portrayed here by Michael Keaton. Kind of forget the Batman costume and think of Keaton in a business suit, or even better, in a trench coat and a fedora. Angleton was an oddball. He worked strange hours, came and go as he went, had a weird office on the second floor of CIA headquarters, all of blinds down, curtains drawn, dim lights, files, papers, things all over the place, smoke in the air. He was a chain smoker. And he was notorious for kind of giving new hires this indoctrination speech that came to be known as the briefing, capital T, capital B. And you'd sit there and listen to Angleton spin these complicated tales of Soviet intelligence perfidy, and you were either awed or you'd kind of think, that guy's a wacko. And that's why I say, right from the start, he was polarized, and that's one reason why we don't understand him really well, because most of the stuff written about him by historians, journalists, and intelligence practitioners is very much pro or anti. There really is not, to this day, a full objective study of Angleton. I've tried to do a little bit of that inside the agency and in some of my public writings. And he's just a fascinating guy, in part because of the way he conceived how the intelligence business worked, and in particular counterintelligence, the wilderness of mirrors, this phrase that he borrowed from an English poet, T.S. Eliot, whom he studied at Yale when he was an English lit major. It really captures his mindset. This quote from him is a great depiction of his view of intelligence as a weird blend of reality and unreality, of fact and fantasy. And the whole point here is that the Soviets are making us think that they are doing things that they really aren't, that they are weaker than they really are, that they are benign when actually they're hostile. And he saw them engaged in a massive enterprise that he called strategic deception, in which the KGB would send out all of these phony agents, false defectors, double agents, dangles, people we would recruit thinking they were good when actually they're planted. And they were all carrying phony stories about what the Soviets were doing, could do, planned to do, all intended to make us think that the Soviet Empire was not really as threatening as it really was. And there's a mole on the inside, because the way in which the hostile service figures out that we're buying all this garbage that they're putting out through their false agents is because they have a penetration on inside our agency, reporting back to the KGB, hey, they bought that one, or you need to tweak that story a little bit, or whatever. So it's a constant feedback loop here. And this is the way he perceived the Soviets working. Now, he had a lot of evidence for this, because there was a long list of intelligence compromises going back to the early Cold War that he could look at and see how the Soviets had tricked Western services. I can't go into all the details of them, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of counterintelligence compromises throughout this period of time. And the point from Angleton's standpoint, roughly in the early 1960s, is if you look around us, you see that the Soviets have gotten inside practically every Western service of note and done serious damage. Why assume that we're so great that we're immune? In fact, I was duped by my friend Kim Philby. So if they can dupe me, they can dupe anybody. There has to be a mole on the inside because there's too much evidence to suggest there isn't. And we don't know what we don't know because we have no other sources to disprove that premise. We don't have the signals intelligence anymore, but thanks to Weisband and Philby. We don't have any good agents inside Soviet intelligence anymore. They've either been rolled up or their information is stale. So presume penetration and then go look for it. What's the alternative? To just sit back and get destroyed, like these other Western services were on their way? And this launches the mole hunt. And the mole hunt is fed by information from Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB defector, who kind of is music to Angleton's ears, because everything Angleton believes, Golitsyn provides information and non-information for. And then there's another defector, Yuri Nisenko, who comes out and contradicts Golitsyn. Well, that's pretty bad for Nisenko, because nobody's going to contradict Anatoly Golitsyn. Nisenko winds up getting put under detention for 3.5 years in an effort to get him to break and admit that he's one of those false defectors that Angleton and others said that would be sent out against Western intelligence. He doesn't break, and that becomes a major controversy. The mole hunt is fed through mostly Golitsyn's information, but other information. Golitsyn provides a little bit of a take on who the mole might be. The problem with that profile is that we had recruited or hired lots of people of Eastern European and Slavic backgrounds because they had the area expertise, and they were the types of people we were trying to recruit as agents. So we brought the mole into our midst, in effect, because of the way we recruited and hired. We also, in looking back at a lot of the cases, find lots and lots of people at the agency had something to do with the cases. There's a fingerprint of somebody on many, many files. And it's a huge counterintelligence investigation exercise to go back and figure out why a case was compromised. And you wind up creating kind of a spiderweb effect, because you saw the file, so you were suspect, but then you recruited this person who later turned bad, so that's, and so forth. It's a very, very complicated way to run investigations. Eventually, we narrow the suspect list to about 14 people, and they really have a tough time because they're stigmatized with that security blemish on their files, and that's almost an indelible mark. It takes a long, long time to get rid of that. Was there a mole? Yes, but he wasn't working at the agency anymore, and he didn't really do that much damage. But that can't be the whole story. So the mole hunt goes on for year after year after year. And by the end of Angleton's career, he had become what you might call a bit detached from reality. I think some of the stereotype portrayals of him in the literature as paranoid and borderline psychotic are way, way off. But I do think whatever good he had been doing early on in protecting U.S. secrets and pursuing counterintelligence investigations, which did turn up moles in other services, but not in the U.S., he was a little bit unstrung. It all comes crashing down because of a leak. Two very controversial domestic operations the agency was running. They were reading American citizens' mail and spying on anti-war protesters, all of this at the behest of U.S. presidents, became known because of Seymour Hersh getting his hands on some internal secrets from the agency. Well, this is Angleton's end, and he's summarily dismissed in late December 1974. Now, what happens afterward? Well, this is kind of the wrong legacy to learn from the Angleton experience. Immediately, counterintelligence is a dispossessed enterprise. Nobody wants to do it. It's a stepchild. It becomes a place for short-timers and underperformers. The head of the counterintelligence staff will no longer be a counterintelligence professional. They will rotate through 2 years, 3 years max. It's a dead end. And suddenly, the perception is if Angleton did it, we're going in the other direction as fast as we can. An anti-Angleton orthodoxy kind of grips the agency, and it came to be known as the Angleton syndrome later on. Because what we do find after Angleton leaves is lots and lots of counterintelligence and security problems, not just in the CIA. These are our rogues, a number of whom started to spy after Angleton left, but also in other services. And the next part of the story, story number 3, deals with one of those, Aldrich Ames. probably CIA's most destructive spy ever. Aldrich Ames was a Soviet operations officer, briefly a counterintelligence analyst, with a pretty notorious record over the years. He was sometimes good in the field, but a lot of times he was largely incompetent, and a good deal of that he was drunk. And he never really got a good handle on how to run overseas operations terribly well. He moved from post to post, was deemed unreliable in many respects, but largely his managers just covered up for him. And he moved through his career to increasingly responsible positions, to the point later on he was head of Soviet counterintelligence. And in 1985, because of financial issues, a desire for quick cash, he sells his services to the Soviet Union. Now, what's the Arlington connection? He lived here with his wife, Rosario Ames, kind of the Imelda Marcos of American counterintelligence. When they were all captured in 1994, she was found with something like 500 pairs of pantyhose and 150 pairs of shoes and all sorts. Maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong, but I think you get the point. There's just enormous profligacy here. They had a really nice house. It's over there on 2512 North Randolph Street. Interestingly enough, Rick Ames paid for this with $540,000 of cash, along with a $50,000 Jaguar. He got a complete kind of dental overhaul. He suddenly started to dress nicely. Previously had been kind of a rumpled character. And he's really getting kind of spiffy. Well, where's all this money coming from? Well, we know. In 1985, he delivers to the Soviets the names of all of our assets inside the Soviet Union. Now, how does he get away with doing this? Because his project at the time, and he had official permission to do this, was to contact Soviet diplomats in Washington and meet with them face to face with the idea of maybe recruiting them. Well, what a great cover for action. I'm meeting with a Soviet diplomat, ostensibly to recruit him, and I'm actually passing him secrets, and everybody thinks I'm doing my job. He took out thousands of pages of documents over a roughly 9-year espionage career, but the first 2 tranches of information were deadly to some people. He is responsible for the deaths of 10 Soviet assets who were rolled up and executed. Dmitry Polyakov on the upper left, a brigadier general in Soviet military intelligence, one of the best sources we ever had. He worked briefly with the Bureau, and then they turned him over to us, and we ran him from roughly 62 to 1980. A brilliant source of information about stuff across the board. Ames turns over his name. He is not... let me back up. In 1980, Robert Hansen, the FBI mole for the Russians, turned over Polyakov's name, but there wasn't enough evidence of that information. Ames adds to it in 85, and at this point, the Soviets move in and arrest, torture, and eventually execute Polyakov. Adolf Tolkachev, the poor guy with the in the headlock there, was a researcher at a Soviet military technology institute, who during a roughly 7-year career working for us turned over huge amounts of technical information that probably saved the US military billions of dollars, because it didn't have to build things that it didn't need, and it could develop countermeasures and so forth. Caught, tortured, executed. The upper right and lower left, Matorin and Martinov are KGB officers, also executed. Oleg Gordievsky survived because he was tipped off and fled his posting in London. He was the deputy resident of the KGB in London. He exfiltrates with British help to Finland and then gets away and wound up becoming a very, very useful asset for Western intelligence. But there are other mortalities up there for which Ames is directly responsible. Well, there's an investigation finally launched to track down Ames, but here's the problem. Justice is finally achieved here in 1994 when Ames is arrested outside of his home. There was a pretext meeting arranged whereby he was called in on President's Day to supposedly handle some hot item that had arisen in the overnight traffic. His boss calls him in. This is all prearranged. And by this time, the investigators had tracked down a lot of incriminating evidence. They'd, with permission, broken into his home, searched his records, dumped his hard drive, looked through his trash, monitored his movements, and they found a lot of incriminating evidence, and this finally was sufficient for the FBI to move in and grab him under this pretext of going out of the house for this meeting. Well, what's the problem here? The problem is, because of the Angleton hangover, the Angleton syndrome, the FBI and the agency in particular spent years chasing false leads because they simply would not look at the idea that there was a mole responsible for the deaths of these agents. Instead, it had to be things like bad street tradecraft. So your agents are picked out in the meetings in Moscow or in other cities. Communications breaks. They're listening to our comms just like we were listening into them under Venona. Those Marine guards who keep opening the door and letting their lovers into the offices to rummage through records and things. Ed Lee Howard, a CIA defector in 1985, surely working for the Soviet division prospectively, he must have known about all these cases. So those are the leads that we're chasing, and in the meantime, the Soviets are sending out deceptive information to steer us down blind alleys. This goes on for a number of years. What nobody is doing is saying, none of this all fits together. Howard is explaining a couple, the Marine Guards a couple, and so forth. There's still lots of cases for which there's no answer except the mole. That's the Angleton syndrome at work, and that's one reason why Rick Ames got away with his treachery for as long as he did. Well, in 1985, there is a series of counterintelligence scandals that was referred to as the Year of the Spy, in which Soviet agents like John Walker and his friend and relatives, Ronald Pelton, a Chinese mole inside CIA, Larry Wu Tai Chin, a CIA overseas officer, Sharon Scranage, and about 8 or 9 others were caught and arrested for espionage. This prompts an awakening on the part of the US government. Congress weighs in with some very critical reports. The Counterintelligence Center is created in 1988 in an attempt to address this issue. But it really is a reinvention of Angleton's bureaucratic model of the counterintelligence staff. Counterintelligence professionals, run by professionals, working for the director in their own unit. Angleton CI staff reinvented. I'd mentioned the problem with the Ames case and then the conflict between the Bureau and the CIA. After Ames is caught in 1994, various measures are taken to help protect secrets, and they work quite well. In the case of Harold Nicholson, shown there on the lower left, he's the highest-ranking CIA officer ever arrested for espionage. He was a GS-15, a colonel captain equivalent in the US military. Thankfully, he didn't do a whole lot of damage because he was caught relatively quickly because of these new processes put in place after Ames, particularly financial disclosure. The reason Ames was caught, by the way, is that somebody on the investigation staff had a brilliant insight. They were looking at all of this information about Ames, and they noticed an interesting coincidence. He would have a meeting with one of these Soviet so-called diplomats, and then a day or two later, a bank deposit of just under $10,000 to avoid detection would be made in one of his several accounts. This happened time after time after time. That's a pretty clear case, and that's what really launched the FBI onto the trail and got them to be able to track down that other information. Well, what does this have to do with Nicholson? By the time Nicholson starts his espionage work in 1994, Ames had been rolled up, and internal investigations had been done about how badly the pursuit of Ames had been handled. In short, Nicholson knows how lousy the counterintelligence process was during that period of time, and he figures he can get away with it. It's pretty astounding after Ames is arrested. That's when Nicholson decides to go turn himself over to the Soviets, or the Russians by this time. Well, he's caught, but then it's now very, very clear with the emergence of the Robert Hansen case, captured in the early 2000s. He is the Soviet Russian mole inside the FBI, that the FBI is doing the same thing in trying to track down that lead, that source of compromise, that we were doing with Ames, refusing to admit that it could have been one of our own people gone bad. In fact, they went so far as to blame a CIA officer who was put on the shelf for almost 3 years and his family harassed by the FBI because they insisted he was the guilty party. And they never even apologized when they finally found out through some kind of interesting acquisition of information about Hansen that he was one of their own guys. And now Hansen is enjoying the rest of his life out in Supermax, along with great American citizens like Richard Reed and Ted Kuklinski and Ulasewicz, I guess the Unabomber, and a couple of other hardcore criminals. Okay, those are 3, I hope, interesting stories about intelligence and counterintelligence in Arlington. They're all sort of interrelated, not just they occurred here, but there's a long thread running through them. And I think it makes kind of a fascinating serial portrait of the importance of the counterintelligence discipline, the ways in which it can be extremely effective, ways in which it can be counterproductive, and most importantly, making sure that when you're dealing with a controversy, a scandal, learn the right lessons, and don't forget the past. And I'll be... Time for a few questions. Ready to jump? Yeah. Yes, sir, up front.
What say you about today's security of information within our intelligence agencies?
Yeah. In the days of leak investigations, it's a sensitive issue. What I'm more generally concerned about broadly is I'm still troubled that counterintelligence is not really viewed as a national strategic concern. There's a component of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence called the National Counterintelligence Executive, NCIX. And as best I can tell, and maybe I'm speaking from some partial ignorance here, but it does seem to be a marginal player in the whole process. It issues reports, it does damage assessments, but I rarely see NCIX and its revolving door leadership really heavily involved in issues like you mentioned. And so we're still kind of trying to get it right from that standpoint. The intelligence reform of 2004-05 that created the DNI and carried over an NCIX predecessor into that structure, I'm still not persuaded that it's doing all it could do to protect our security and our secrets. Yes, sir.
Your observations tonight have, I guess, understandably settled around political and defense-oriented espionage. What about business and industrial espionage? Trade secrets, economic espionage, that type of thing today?
Right. I'm not in a real great position to talk about current events, but there are frequently public reports released by the intelligence community on economic espionage, and you can certainly read in the press numerous accounts of ways in which the Chinese, the French, other countries, friends supposedly who are not quite friends in all purposes. I mean, it's a kind of a truism in the intelligence business that there's no such thing as a friendly service. It's just a service that has common interests with you at certain times. And so aside from the kind of inviolate British Commonwealth services that we share lots with and have agreements not to conduct operations against, nor are they against us, every other service around the world, whether they're allied with us or not against a common threat, is really engaged in a relationship of convenience. And oftentimes economic espionage is a good window into that. It's been a persistent problem over the years. It's technology theft. It's a cheap way to acquire material and information. The Chinese are great at it. There was a report in the Post this past week about all the military systems that they've acquired through hacking and cyber attacks. Very, very troublesome. From our standpoint, we don't do that. Economic espionage, that is the CIA going out and spying on foreign corporations for national security purposes, was considered briefly as a new mission for the agency in the early 1990s after the Cold War ended. After all, what are you going to do? The big enemy is gone. Well, let's go spy on Sanyo and automakers and such for the benefit of national security. Well, that's just for the benefit of U.S. corporations. And there was a discussion about it for a year or two in the early 90s, but it was never picked up. And so the agency does not collect economic intelligence for that kind of purpose. It collects economic intelligence about the economic systems and welfare and policies of foreign countries, but it does not target foreign corporations to exploit their information the same way that other countries do ours.
Yes. The FBI, in response to the Freedom of Information Act request, has publicized a plethora, vast amounts of information about espionage cases available in what they call the reading room.
Yes.
Is there anything comparable to CIA information on counterintelligence?
Not as specifically, in part because CIA counterintelligence operations are directed at foreign concerns for intelligence purposes. The FBI is a law enforcement agency, so when it conducts a counterintelligence investigation, the point is not to run an operation for a lengthy period of time to find the entire scope of it the way the CIA would do. It's to get enough evidence to grab those people and take them out of circulation, get a conviction and toss them in jail, or if they're official cover, toss them out of the country. Consequently, a lot of FBI counterintelligence information makes its way into the public domain through the legal process. And that's one reason why they can post so much public information out there. So, and a great resource for historians of counterintelligence are legal affidavits and documents, transcripts of court trials. Now that said, the CIA does have a Freedom of Information Act reading room. It's on our public website, cia.gov. And this is a place in which we put all of our declassified materials, including lots of formerly secret histories that my staff and my predecessors on the staff have written, in addition to large collections of declassified documents on a wide variety of analytic, technical, administrative, and in some cases, operational subjects as well. So yeah, go to cia.gov and find the place in the library tab, Freedom of Information Act reading room. I'm afraid we haven't made it real easy for you, but it's there if you just poke around enough. Ma'am.
Do we have any country that we're now equivalent to Russia that we're looking at or wondering what they're doing?
I think the principal threats right now in the world are pretty obvious, and therefore the principal intelligence targets for us and allied services, China, North Korea, Iran, and transnational threats, terrorist groups, weapons proliferators, to a lesser extent, drug runners, narco traffickers, human trafficking gets certain kinds of attention, those things like that. Yeah, there's a full-bore effort, all-source collection being conducted against those, and defending ourselves from their attacks too, because they're after us in much the same way the Soviets were earlier. He is in a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, serving a life without parole sentence. His wife, Rosario, did quite a bit more to enable his espionage activity than, say, Ethel Rosenberg. I mean, it's very clear from the wiretaps that she's encouraging him. She's saying, "Why didn't you get to that meeting on time?" And she's a real harridan, and just loves the money that's coming in so she can have her 500 pairs of shoes or whatever they are. And the deal struck was that Ames would not only confess and cooperate, and he was debriefed for hundreds and hundreds of hours by various authorities. In exchange for that, she would get a reduced sentence so she could get out of jail in a relatively short time. I think she served 7 years, so she could raise their child. I believe so, yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, Rick Ames is up in Pennsylvania for good.
Dr. Robarge, thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Really interesting to hear. I especially like your very last comment where you said, don't forget about the past. Remember the past. What are the lessons that have been learned since Ames and Hansen and the others, that would prevent that kind of situation from happening again? Where you've got a very high-level person who's very trusted, who's done, background investigations, he's been polygraphed, and so on and so forth. But yet, he, was able to get by. I mean, have there been other safeguards that you can talk about that have been put in place since then to prevent that from happening?
Well, routinely, potential new hires to the agency are polygraphed, in addition to having full background investigations. Once in, there are periodic, though irregular, re-polygraphs. There are periodic reportings of financial information that can be used later on if there's some kind of irregularity, like if I drove in tomorrow in a Maserati at my pittance of an income, people might kind of wonder, either somebody died, you won the lotto, or you're a spy. It's got to be one of the three. And the financial information that we periodically file has to track with the public information that they can get out through warrants. And if you don't report it right, you're in a bit of trouble. Those kind of basic safeguards. But you speak to one thing that's kind of an overarching issue with counterintelligence is it just goes against the grain of the American political psyche. We don't like security. We don't like snoops. We don't like surveillance unless we're doing it. And consequently, we refuse to live in an aggressive counterintelligence regime where in and out every day at work, our briefcases are searched, our purses are searched. We are randomly polygraphed, called in to say, what were you doing overseas on that trip you just came back from? We're not going to stand for that as Americans. And that's one of the conundrums of counterintelligence. Another one is that this may be astounding to you, maybe not, but there has never been a second in Cold War and post-Cold War history when there weren't enemy spies working inside U.S. intelligence. As I am speaking, there are, I have no idea how many, undetected hostile agents inside our intelligence services. If you take every known intelligence operative caught and you put their career on a timeline and you just do this like weaving a rug, you will find no gaps in that entire chronology. Somebody has been after us multiple times at every time in our and our sister services' histories. So it's an actuarial fact that somebody's penetrated us. But here's kind of the conundrum. You catch the spy, great counterintelligence work, you're a hero, you deserve a medal. No. How'd they get in the door? Why didn't you catch them sooner? How are you going to atone for the damage they did? And then, if you're not catching the spies, it's not because your security is so great, it's because, since we know they're there, you just haven't found them yet. So you're not a very good counterintelligence service. No-win proposition. And on it goes. That's why counterintelligence is so fascinating, but so darnably frustrating at times in just making it work right. And in the current bureaucratic configuration that we have now, I'm not quite sure it's getting the attention it deserves.
I would like to thank Dr. Robarge very much. And also, Dr. Robarge is a historian and he reads books.
Real books, not Kindles.
She's a real